What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Rad Chad Show. Today we've got a review for you of Too Many Bones, and hopefully this is going live right in time for the new Kickstarter of their expansion, which seems like it's going to add a whole bunch of content. But the question here is, the base game itself, you're going to need that in order to play the expansion, so is it worth your while? The game's getting a lot of great hype. It's got some great reviews. Let's get my take starting now. Okay, rather than doing a rules overview, we're just going to talk about the individual mechanics of the game and the general concept of it as we sort of do the review. There are a lot of moving parts in this game. It's very similar to Spirit Island in the sense that I call it kind of death by a thousand cuts. There are just a ton of very, very small rules. None of them are necessarily difficult to grasp per se. There's just a lot there, and it can be overwhelming and take up a heck of a lot of time if you're trying to do a review for the game. But the general concept of the game is you've got your little band of 4 heroes, and you're trying to take on some nemesis, right? It could be a goblin king or this orc-looking dude, or just the box comes with a wide array of villains that you can take on. And that's one of the first things that I'd like to say is a positive about the game is the amount of replayability in terms of what you're fighting against is highly replayable. There's, I don't know, I haven't counted them, maybe 10 different villains that you can battle in the game. Each villain's got their own like unique encounter cards. They all use different enemies. Now, some of the enemies might be the same for this villain as it would be for that villain, but they still vary enough to make each game different. So I really like that about the game. So basically, when you go to take on these villains, you are going to build this encounter deck. And the encounter deck basically will give you a brief, when you draw one of these cards at the beginning of a turn, it'll give you a brief story about what you're doing. You might be out there hunting in the woods for food. You might be encountering a battle where there is a rope bridge, and basically, you know, you need to cross the rope bridge, and you got to determine, okay, are we going to charge through, or are we going to sit back and pick people off with arrows? And each one of these encounters, not only does it give you that story, but it gives you 2 options as to how you want to deal with this specific encounter. This is another thing that I both like, but also see some room for improvement on. So first of all, I really like the idea of sort of this game being like a role-playing-esque game. Now, even though that's a tagline of the game, I think that's a bit false. This is very much more in the board game camp than it is in the role-playing camp. If you're looking for some grandiose story with this game, I don't think it necessarily exists, but it does give you small little moments where the story flourishes, and that comes in those encounter cards and how you're going to deal with the encounters. And I do like that. I think where this game has room for improvement is rather than having these encounter cards, and this is a brief side note, but those encounter cards have got like a very dark green background, and then they've got very small black text on them. And as is the case with a lot of the components within this game, but especially those encounter cards, it can be very difficult to read with a dark text on dark background and very small font. It's a minor nitpick, but when you see it so frequently, especially with also the cheat sheets in the game, it just kind of, I don't know, it's something to keep in mind if you have poor eyes or just really that type of thing annoys you. Anyways, that's a totally different subject. I think this game would have really benefited by having an encounter book, something like This War of Mine or Near and Far or any of these like story adventure games, because I think that they were very limited. Okay, you've got this card size, right? This is the amount of flavor, text, and story I can actually involve. Then you flip over the card. You have to fit both options that you want to do for that specific encounter in a very tiny card text. And again, I think this would have been a great opportunity of, hey, let's build in a storybook where we can further flesh out this, and I think that would have really helped the game. But what is there is fairly good, and there are quite a few encounters, so got to give them credit where credit is due. I like that, but it could be improved. So you engage in an encounter. There are some very unique encounters, which I like a lot, but typically speaking, you are going to engage in some battle, right? And basically what you do for a battle is you figure out what day you're currently on, so you have to reach the final boss within a certain amount of days, and each round you click that day timer up 1, and so you see what day you're on, typically speaking, and then you multiply that by the amount of players. So let's say we're on day 3, and it's a 2-player game, that would be 6 points, right? Then you go to this baddie pile, and baddie are the just enemies that you are going to fight throughout the game. And there are 1-point baddies, 5-point baddies, and 20-point baddies. So in this case, we need to build a 6-point baddie deck, right? So I'd get a 5-point baddie, and then I'd get a 1-point baddie. So we've only got to fight 2 people. And then you would place them out here on this map. Now, the map in specific is a little bit small. It's cramped. I don't think it gives you much room for tactical movement, especially in some of these larger games where you have 4 players out on the board, then you have 4 enemies out on the board. So of those 8 people that are out on the board, there's only 8 extra spaces that can be used. And so what you'll find in a lot of cases is there's just not much moving around in the game. There are brief moments that can really illustrate and the tactical combat can shine through. For example, one of the easier, I would almost call him like a starter boss, would be the Goblin King. Well, he's got an interesting special ability that he lobs grenades at you, and if you get close, he can kind of throw you across the map. So you have to take in consideration in advance of fighting that boss that, hey, I'm going to need a whole lot of dexterity, which not only is your currency basically to determine how far you can move, but it's also your currency to determine how many dice you can roll. So there's always this give and take balance of, okay, I'm going to need to be able to move, but I also need to be able to then attack and throw more dice and things like that. I really like that about the game, but again, that board, outside of a few specific scenarios, feels just a click too cramped. So anyways, you get thrown into this combat encounter. There are ranged enemies, and then there's melee enemies. You're going to put them in different areas on the board. There's sort of like this battle queue, as I'll maybe call it. I don't know if it's the battle queue, because that's the chips that you put out there that you're going to have to fight. But there's like an initiative track, right? And so you roll your dice, and you see where you guys fit in the initiative track. And so maybe an enemy goes first, then player 1, then 2 more enemies, then player 3. And you can manipulate that initiative track. There are a lot of moving pieces when it comes to the battle, but I like some of the simplicity about it, right? So like ranged, for example, you don't have to worry about things like line of sight, which is always a pain in a game like, let's say, for example, Doom, which I really love Doom, but I really don't like having to figure out line of sight. There are also some cool things with the individual characters. And we're going to talk about this now for a decent chunk of time, because I think the bread and butter of this specific game really lies on the quality of the characters. Now, the base game comes with 4 characters. You've got a healer, you've got a rampaging, attacking monstrosity, you have got a bomb builder that sits back and just lobs grenades from afar, and then who am I missing? You've got basically a tank. And so each character, this is probably the biggest pro about the game, plays dramatically different from all the other characters. I've played as each one, and I've played, I think, probably just about every combination you can have of the characters if you're playing in, like, let's say, a 2-player game, for example. I've also played solo, and the characters just really shine through. And so not only do you have tremendously unique characters in and of themselves between the 4, but then each character has got this branching skill tree. So basically, as you complete these encounters, you'll get things like loot. Loot can be divided in the form of just regular loot, or it can be trove loot. Trove loot's kind of unique because you have to take actions at the end of your turn to kind of unlock the trove loot before you can actually access it. There's a neat little mini game in there. It kind of reminds me of the dice mechanics within Elder Sign. I do like that. I think that it was maybe a bit unnecessary, and you could scale back some of those, again, death by 1,000 cuts with a whole bunch of rules. This is one area where you could have scaled back, but I do like it. And then the most important thing is you get skill points. Well, skill points can be used in leveling up your base statistics, such as your health, your dexterity, your attack, your defense, for example. Those are all tremendously important, especially dexterity, which I mentioned earlier, because that dictates how much you can move and how many dice you can actually roll. But if you don't want to level up those, and at some point you're going to want to spend those skill points on your dice. So you've got this neat little tray. It's a plastic tray. It holds all of your dice very well. They're numbered like 1 through give or take 20. And basically you can unlock specific dice. Now there's going to be kind of like a video game. There's going to be a starter skill that you need to unlock. And then that skill will then branch out. And there will be other, normally like beefier versions or different versions of that skill that you can then unlock. So take, for example, the Tantrum character, who's that like rampaging attack monstrosity little character. They're a blast to play as, right? So they can get dice that can manipulate their rage. So every time they get attacked or every time they attack, all of a sudden that character is getting more and more ticked off, right? And then you can roll dice that manipulate how ticked off you basically are. And once you get to a certain threshold, you can just auto kill people. Or if you get too ticked off, well, now you got to cool down, right? You got to wait a whole turn. Your dice gets turned back, and now you got to build that anger back up. So there are a whole bunch of different dice that you can unlock, and each character has just insanely different dice pools. I don't think there's any dice that are identical as far as what you would unlock with your specific skills. So that brings me to a good thing about the characters, which is that there is a decent level of replayability within those characters, because you're not going to unlock all of those dice typically within a play session unless you play one of the significantly longer villains. So you might take branching path A in your first game and branching path B in your second game with a specific character. But I will tell you, after you play a character maybe 5 times, I play Tantrum probably the most, and I say after about 5 times, the novelty will wear thin, and you'll realize for specific villains, specific enemy groups, there are skill tree paths that will be better catered than other ones. And so that replayability, while it is there, I don't think it's as grandiose as, say, a game like Spirit Island, where you have really huge decks of cards, and you're going to be drawing randomly throughout those decks of cards, figuring out, go check out the Spirit Island review that I have. So the replayability is good from the character's perspective, but not great. But this is really important because I think the game, the strongest suit it has is how good those characters are to actually play. I don't care as much about the villains or the enemies that I'm fighting against as much as I am building my own character. That is my core focus of the game. And so something like this expansion is great to see because that's going to add more characters. There's also more characters that you can buy. But you've got to understand, the game's really expensive to begin with. You're going to chunk out $125 for the game, and then each character is going to be an additional $25. So, I mean, it's a pricey game, and you got to figure out whether or not it's worth that investment to you. Okay, so let's see what else I've got here as far as the review is concerned. I've got kind of like it broken down by good and bad stuff. These are small ones. There's a lot of keyword text, so when you get into these battles, each enemy has got some sort of keyword on it, right? It could be hardy, it could be flying, it could be poison, it could be I don't even know what. And I'm telling you, for your first few games, it's overload, especially with these cheat sheets that you have, which they're double-sided, and boy, they have just cram-packed like everything into these cheat sheets. They do a great job for the most part. But again, for those first several games, I mean, your eyes will like glaze over a little bit when you try to read these cheat sheets. I mentioned all the other negatives, so let's talk about some of the final positives that I have about the game. I think it's got a great sense of power progression. When you start this game off, you feel weak, but some of the initial encounters are very easy. As you gain more and more skills, the enemies get harder and harder. There becomes more and more enemies. There's a great sense of progression. As you get more powerful, they get more difficult, and I really like that about the game. I think that it really encourages teamwork, if only because those characters are so dramatically different, right? You've got a healer, you got a tank, you got an attacker, you've got a ranged person who throws bombs, and they all play so dramatically different that you really need to work together as a team. As far as the solo experience goes, I haven't played enough to fully warrant, I guess, a proper critique of all of the characters, but at least in my initial reports, I'd say there are certain characters like Tantrum, for example, and this is why I've played that character more. They're more conducive to solo play because Tantrum is a great attacker, and Tantrum can also heal themselves, so they've got sort of like a dual aspect to them. Pickett's another good example. He's a pretty good, he's a great defender, and towards the latter half of the game, once you've built some things up, he can also be a pretty good attacker. I'd say those two are fairly good at solo play. The healer, on the other hand, and the bomb thrower, I just don't know how well they're truly going to play out as solo play. So if you're a solo player, just understand that, you know, unless you cater the specific enemies and the specific villain to your specific hero, I think you could struggle a little bit. Also, the game is unbelievably difficult. Unless you are playing on the greenhorn difficulty, which gives you like extra health, it gives you extra skill points right off the bat, you are going to get dismantled. You are going to get owned to begin with. And I'm no stranger to difficult games, but boy, this one was a shocker. I was like, oh no, I'll put on normal. I won't listen to the rule book. Hey, just forget greenhorn. I'd be fine. I got this, right? Like, no, you will die. It's also got excellent production values for the most part. So it's really interesting. They've got all of these, they're almost sort of like clay poker chips, but they've got great illustrations on them. I really love those components. The dice are good, but for every good thing that you can say, and there are a lot of great things that you can say about the production values of the game, there's always these like little issues that hold it back from being amazing. So, for example, the dice were starting to show wear after only about 5 plays. The text on those cards is really, really small. There are a lot of rule ambiguities because the rule book's good, but not necessarily great. So again, there's some quality issues, although on the whole, I think the production value is pretty doggone good. And that's it. That's everything I have to say about Too Many Bones. So at the end of the day, if I had to put a score on it, I'd give the game probably a 7 out of 10. It's one of these games where I find it's right on the cusp of, do I want to keep it long term, or is it just beneath my threshold to where, you know, hey, if I got rid of it, I wouldn't mind too much. You know, I can still acknowledge it's a good game, but I mean, how many cooperative games do you really need? And this sort of fits into that category. I think I had a blast playing the games that I did. I just don't know if I feel overly urged to continue to play the game. So with all that said, I like the game. I like it a lot. I don't know if it's quite good enough to stay on my shelf forever and ever, amen. But definitely check out the Kickstarter coming up. See what content that has to offer as far as extending the life of this game. And if, you know, this is the game that sounds like it's right for you, I definitely suggest you check it out because, again, I really enjoy the game. So, again, that was Too Many Bones. Solid 7 out of 10. And if you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Thanks.
Thank you for watching The Rad Chad Show. Till next time.